Illinois was the last state to be written, and I wrote a parody haiku before writing the real one because I was just so sick of writing at this point. And the parody haiku, I can remember it, I think. It was last to be written. Creativity has waned. Fucking Illinois. So not exactly appropriate, but I have never told anyone that story.
Maggie Dewane is a writer, filmmaker, and communications expert who has traveled to all 7 continents to understand climate change, conservation efforts, and how both impact people. Through short films, news articles, and poetry, she translates climate science to lay audiences to empower them to act. Maggie holds a Master's of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University and a Bachelor's of Science from Seton Hall University in Diplomacy and International Relations. She has worked for the White House Council on Environmental Quality under the Obama administration and for lobbying group We Act for Environmental Justice. Haiku and Hope, Maggie's debut collection, is a celebration of America's natural wonders, a call to action in the face of climate change, and a testament to the power of poetry to move us. Let's just get right into it.
Yeah.
How are you? What have you been up to?
Doing all right, thank you. So, in addition to preparing for the launch of this book and getting ready to celebrate it, of course, I work a 9-to-5 job in environmental communications for a national nonprofit. And right now, the environment is on the chopping block with our new administration. So, everything has been all hands on deck, extremely busy, long nights. But I love what I do. So I'm really lucky in that I get to talk about wildlife all day, every day, and try to convince other people that this is really important and we need to care about it. So even though it's been busy, I'm lucky that I enjoy doing it and talking about it. And then just last week, actually wrapped up the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital here in DC, which is something that I love being a part of. I am a former filmmaker to the festival itself, and now I'm on the advisory council. And so once a year, we get to be a part of this amazing film fest that brings in exceptionally talented filmmakers and film screenings that expose us to not only amazing stories, but some of the other environmental plights that we are facing around the world. So it's been extremely busy, but I'm excited to actually talk about the book here with you today.
That's so cool. I saw that you were a former filmmaker.
I think an amateur filmmaker at best.
What do you think, or could you tell me what in particular tends to move the needle the most when you're talking to climate change denialists, I guess is what they're called?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the loaded question, right? We're jumping right in. I love it. I think if there was a silver bullet, we would have already implemented it. We being those of us who do think climate change is the biggest threat to society today. But I think it's a combination of things. First, the power of film and the power of writing are two different tools in the toolbox. Film and visuals, you can really storytell in a visceral way that it just provides that picture, literally, to people. For example, I think of some documentaries that show over time melting glaciers that have been observed, over the decades. You can't argue with photos documenting the change, right? And then there's the power of words, which you can bring somebody who doesn't have access to travel. You can bring somebody around the world and share intimate stories like I've tried to do in this book in a quick way, in a snapshot kind of way that capture attention, pique curiosity, and speak to some people who might be more curious in terms of the context rather than the actual pretty pictures imagery. But that's all to say those are two tools in the toolbox. I think a key way to engage with climate denialists is actually with asking questions and showing up with compassion and patience, because it is a hard thing to think, man, we might have to shift some of how we live today in order to do what's right by our planet, to keep living in the ways that we enjoy. And so I think climate denialists should, even though it sometimes feels like you're beating your head against the wall, should be met with some compassion and patience, because turning anything into a screaming match is not going to change or move the needle, as you said. So even though that's very difficult, it's perhaps the hardest thing we can do if we want to engage.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's get into your background. Tell me more about your educational background and how you fell into poetry.
Of course. So the two are a little different here. So there are two stories running parallel to one another, and I'll jump into the education. So I studied diplomacy and international relations in undergrad, and then environmental science and policy in graduate school. And in college, I entered college wanting, and I still do want, to impact the bigger picture. And at the time, to me, policy at an international level, negotiating with allies and adversaries, whomever, this was what I wanted to really focus my career on. And I graduated college early and went right to work with the US Senate, which was one of the best experiences I think I could have had, if not the best experience I could have had right out of college. I served as the senator's executive assistant, as well as his military, veterans, foreign, and LGBTQ affairs representative. So I had a really expansive portfolio. And with the senator, quick tangent here, he and I later found out that he and my grandfather served in the same signal corps in World War II. And then we later found out that my grandmother was his high school social studies teacher. And I say this to just illustrate that he and I ended up developing a close familial relationship in which he was a very supportive mentor. So when, after a few years, I finished working with him, or was coming to my close working with him, I said, listen, I want to go back to school and specialize in environmental studies. Are you okay with me leaving your office? And he's like, absolutely, go forth and conquer. And so it was at his recommendation and my mom's recommendation that I applied to Columbia, because they had both gone to school there. So it was kind of fortuitous that I ended up finding a program at Columbia University that was a one-year accelerated program in environmental science and policy. And that's where I got into really honing the message of, this is a planet I want to protect. It's the only one we got, right? And as I said, running parallel to all of this, because neither of those two concentrations are clearly writing or fine arts or anything. I was serving as the editor of my undergraduate school newspaper. And then in graduate school, I was an online senior editor for an academic journal. And so my love of educating the public was starting to grow. And I had actually for a while thought I was going to go to graduate school for journalism. I was accepted, but ended up choosing this one-year accelerated program instead, because I thought I can hone my writing skills independently. It's the technical information that I really need to glean in my education. So anyway, I was learning to report, to fact check, to research in these different editorial positions while getting an education in the topics that I cared most about. And creative writing has just been a theme running throughout my life since I was a kid. And I certainly have talked long enough ad nauseum about my education, so I don't need to get too much into that. Of course, if you want to hear more, I'm happy to, but creative writing has just always been a personal outlet. And I think right now in my life, this has just been a combination of all of these things coming together in a way that hopefully resonates with other people.
Believe it or not, you're not our first Columbia University graduate to be on this channel. A couple of months ago, we had my friend Kathleen Sullivan, who did her undergrad in, I forget the exact name of the program, but I think it was something like Asian, African, and Middle Eastern maybe
Hmm.
studies. I know that whichever program it is, it's like being talked about a lot right now because it's like in the crosshairs.
I'm
And I
sure.
wondered if you could speak a bit about how Colombia has changed since your time there.
Well, it certainly has, that's for sure. I was at Columbia back in 2012, 2013, so there's been a great deal of time between now and then. I know that academically, the program I attended, it was an MPA program at the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, in Environmental Science and Policy, and that program does still exist. But certainly seeing Colombia in the news today, it's more disheartening than not. People absolutely have a right to protest and to not feel that they are going to be removed forcibly, not only from their homes, but from this country. And it's it's really disheartening that such an esteemed university will kowtow to pressures from a presidential administration. And, I certainly can't speak to what's happening behind the scenes. I don't know, make that clear. I can only speak emotionally to what I'm reading in the news or what I'm seeing on my social media feeds. And and to that is what I am disappointed in. And I think our students need to be protected and they have rights and for a presidential administration too to take out such hostilities to a place of higher learning is disgusting, frankly. So I think that's really just my emotional response to your question, frankly.
You touched on this a little bit, but could you speak more about how you think your environmental activism impacts your poetic practice?
This is a good question because I think right now, and part of the reason why I chose this format for this topic is that poetry is an underutilized means of connecting with audiences on environmental issues and concerns, and specifically climate change. I think everything is really quite terrifying if you think about it. If you think about what climate change can mean for coastlines, neighborhoods, animals, entire nations, ecosystems, I mean, you name it, it's everything. Um, Everything will be impacted, and that's overwhelming. And so, with a vicious 24/7 news cycle, frankly, it's just overwhelming to keep up with. It's hard to keep up with, and so poetry can almost be this ethereal expression that takes on the existential crisis and processes it for you. So, whether trying to convey the urgency or need for action, an eco activist could utilize poetry. Or your home might have been ravaged by wildfires or a hurricane, and you turn to poetry to find your feelings. So I think poetry absolutely has room in this space, and more people can turn to it. But sometimes people view, and you might know this from your personal experience as a poet as well, people are turned off by poetry because they think it's inaccessible and they think, well, I'm not a poet. I don't understand it. It's too esoteric for me. And I actually think that's kind of some of the beauty of poetry is that there's no right or wrong way to really do it. So I think that it absolutely has a part to play in especially moments of existentialism, particularly with regard to climate change.
I think that's a beautiful response. Tell me how Haiku and Hope came to be.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I have been drawn to poetry, as I said, since I was a kid and since I first learned what a couplet was. I just love this creative expression. It's, to me, such a permissible way to share your thoughts and feelings. Like I said earlier, there's no right or wrong way to do it. And I am sure that a lot of other creative minds can relate that it just feels good to express yourself in an uninhibited way. And so with haiku, I think too that they are short and they have staying power in that way. As I mentioned too earlier, with a 24-hour news cycle, with social media constantly running through new content, our attention spans certainly have waned, and there's not much room for long form anything. And a haiku, a memorable one, you can hold on to it and save it for later and recall it, and it might stick with you. And to me, this is how I actually started when I was traveling throughout the country, just started writing haiku for myself because I would have these really fleeting, beautiful moments of experience within a state, specifically within a landscape or a species, and I would want to capture it. And so initially, I started writing these haiku for myself. And as a climate communicator, I started to think, well, gosh, what happens if this beautiful scene that I just experienced is gone because we have refused to act on climate change? So a second haiku evolved from that moment, and that is the state reimagined in the future if we don't act. And in the book, as you've seen, it's a juxtaposition that is meant to be stark and hopefully startling as well. So I started writing the poetry, and then because poetry, I recognize, is not, I don't want to say it's not accessible to everyone, but to my point earlier that not everybody gravitates to poetry, that is why I wrote the second half of the book, the prose section or the narrative, because I wanted to give more context to what readers had just read with the haiku and explain it so that it gives you just enough information that you feel educated, informed, and hopefully empowered. So that is another long answer to your question, but it evolved out of this first love and creativity of our country, and then a worry and concern that everything we love and know could be lost.
I think it was absolutely the right call to have the latter section explaining. I did really enjoy that. At what point in the book's development did its overarching themes become apparent to you?
This is a really good question, and I feel like for me, it's a kind of funny question, and that's because I had visions for how this book would be and how it would turn out, but then referencing actually this second half of the book, the prose, the narrative, within the first sentence of writing that section, the entire thing changed. So I had all of the poetry written and I had chunks of the research done. And in the second section of the book, I set the scene for what we're going to be getting into with the state context. Once people get their hands on this book, they'll understand what I'm referring to. But I explain, what is climate change? What are we looking at here? And then as soon as I get to Alabama, that's when it all changed. Because I thought, this is so important. I am going to describe to people, boom, boom, boom. Here's what's happening in alphabetical order. And I don't know why, even though I love being creative, but this academic voice in me was like, this is just how it has to be because this is a serious topic. And it's going to be kind of like a listicle or something. And then as soon as I wrote that first sentence about Alabama, I thought, oh my gosh, no, I have to make this kind of like a road trip exploring the US and just follow themes of what's happening in states collectively or individually and pepper in some of my travel stories and some of my observations. And hopefully that will again resonate, but interest and keep people interested because as we all know, climate change is a complex, heady subject that, I even glaze over sometimes when listening to climate scientists. So I think the overarching themes became apparent after the writing happened or started. And I'm glad for it. Absolutely.
I'm so curious to hear you talk about like the actual like the process of writing. Did you write each haiku within the state like while you were visiting or
Half and half. So I I don't know that I've told anyone yet, but Oklahoma was the first state ever written. And I think it was written like when I was there in the airport only. And then I thought, well, this is kind of fun. I'm going to start doing this for other states. And this was years and years and years ago, before this even idea for a book came to be. And then once I knew I wanted to write something about all 50 states, then I started proactively visiting the states that I had yet to visit. And then I started writing them in the moment a little bit more ardently. So some are reflective, some came after the fact because I certainly visited Rhode Island, for example, long before I started writing any haiku for any states. So that was pulled from past experiences. It was written after the fact, but I would say that most of them were written based on recent or in the moment experiences. And then another fun fact, Illinois was the very last one to be written.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Was it,
think
go ahead with what you were going to say.
well, what I was going to say is actually perhaps not safe for work, not appropriate for your podcast listeners, but Illinois was the last state to be written, and I wrote a parody haiku before writing the real one because I was just so sick of writing at this point. It was kind of like I had visited Illinois years prior. I had recently driven through it. I think I might have even camped. And so I was trying to pull from any of these moments. And the parody haiku, I can remember it, I think. It was last to be written. Creativity has waned. Fucking Illinois. So not exactly appropriate, but I have never told anyone that story. So you can keep it in if you'd like, or you can certainly remove that from this conversation. So yeah, there you have it.
I might make it the opener or the
Yeah.
closer. Do you remember which airport in Oklahoma?
It must have been Oklahoma City, and I was passing through. And then years later, I went on a road trip, drove through Oklahoma, stayed there for a couple days, and I revisited that initial haiku, updated it for sure because I wanted it to be more genuine to the experience. Being in an airport is not genuine to the beautiful landscapes that I was trying to capture, certainly. But yeah, I think that's the one that started it all.
How long did it take to write all of them?
Once I had some of them accumulated, because like I said, I just kind of started peppering them into my own life. I think a couple months maybe, but that's not that I was writing them, you know, day after day. I was going to it casually. So when the inspiration struck and I wanted to write those stark contrasts, that's when it would come. It was inconsistent, put it that way.
What do you most hope people take away from reading this book?
That we all have a part to play, whether big or small, in shaping the future of our country. And I hope that this book inspires, educates, and galvanizes ultimately. Those are my wishes for the book. And as simple as it sounds, I think it has the chance at achieving that.
How do you write about destruction without falling into despair or hopelessness?
Another great question. So to me, as I mentioned earlier, poetry is this creative expression. And with this book, I felt like I was doing my job, doing my duty to communicate what is at stake and what we have at hand. So I want to educate and inform people, but also inspire and remind about these cherished places that we have, whether it is home in Arkansas or Pennsylvania. Yeah, we have these places we love, And if we don't act, this is what could be lost. And so to me, it was like, okay, I know how to write, I know how to communicate, so I need to do this. If I am lucky enough to have traveled to all 50 states in this really amazing country that we have, why shouldn't I share what I've learned with the world in hopes that other people will care just as passionately as I do about protecting this planet? So, in direct response to your question, I feel like, yes, I'm writing about such a devastating subject, but if I wasn't writing about it, I think that's where I would be lost to despair. If I if I just kept all of this knowledge in my own head and didn't share it and didn't try to empower people, that to me would not only be a disservice, but more depressing than the lack of action.
I imagine it's been difficult to market this book.
Um, yes and no. So I think marketing any book is extremely difficult, I am learning. And I wouldn't say necessarily difficult, but it is arduous. It is time consuming, and you really have to put in a lot of effort. It is a hustle, as they say. But this is also extremely timely because, as much as I hoped when writing this book we would have a different presidential administration than we do right now, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a fun, hopeful book. Now it really is kind of that call to action where we're going to be relying heavily on states to pick up the slack where our federal government is lacking right now. And a lot of the stories or actions mentioned in the book, I mean, some of this can and will change, hopefully. It's the point is to illustrate what we know now and what we should be doing. And hopefully, in just a few years' time, we'll look back and read this and still feel inspired by the poetry, but then also be able to say, look at how far we've come. So it is certainly not prescriptive by any means, but I think it's timely in that audiences are craving, like, okay, if our federal government leadership is absolutely lax on climate, what can we all do at state, local, and individual levels?
On a similar note, can we talk a bit about the value of poetry under capitalism?
To me, these do feel like such juxtaposing concepts because poetry is this more, to me, and not to everyone, certainly, is this more ethereal expression, and that it's getting at certain feelings. It's not always direct or expressive, whereas um, direct in its expressions, excuse me. Whereas capitalism is this like definitive behemoth that has a very structured way of existing. And I feel like I often joke around that we are living in a time of capitalism at its worst, frankly. Um, so I think the two concepts feel so contrasting to me. And I think the value of poetry under capitalism kind of gets back to what I mentioned earlier with regard to eco activism. It can be used to process feelings, it can be used to get at something or hint at something not so directly. And when you are angry at capitalism, maybe you turn to poetry to find yourself, to find those feelings, to express, kind of your own version of a middle finger at it. And I mean, hey, I would not want to exist in a world that doesn't have capitalism, don't get me wrong, but I think too, what we are seeing right now is an unfair version of true capitalism. We are instead seeing massive corporations benefit over the actual competitive, as we call them, mom and pop shops now, even though, yeah, there's such a difference between a McDonald's versus, your local brew pub. And if we had more of the brew pubs, would that, I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent here, but you can cut that all out.
No, I think that's great. Do you have a favorite poem in the book?
Man, this one is tough because I am so proud of all of them. And then there are some that just kind of sing to me in a special way. And, you know, it's interesting too because some of them I'm proud of in that, wow, I'm really glad I was able to capture the state in this way. But then some I feel like, well, that perfectly illustrates a moment that I will remember for the rest of my life because I was so joyful at that given time. And so I would use California as an example because it is derived from a specific experience that honestly I will die happy because of that experience. And then there are states like um, I'm thinking of Louisiana and New York because I love them and I'm proud of them for how they turned out. Even though they do too pull on specific experiences, I'm just glad that I was able to capture those feelings in a way that I really hope Louisianans and New Yorkers actually like.
Since you bring it up, maybe we can talk a bit about which locations were most surprising and memorable to you.
Oh, what a hard question. So I think Arizona definitely stuck with me because as I'm sure some listeners know, the American Southwest broadly is facing a mega drought, the worst in 2000 years, I think. Um, and with Arizona being really at the forefront of that drought, seeing so many almond farms, which are this water intensive crop. Why would you put such a thing in a place that is struggling with its water source? To me, that was so stark and jarring. But then on the other side of it, I think of states like California or Hawaii, or even back home, my home state of Pennsylvania. Those haiku really resonate with me because they illustrate specific experiences that were so beautiful and so pure. So it's kind of a both and answer to your question in that some some states really struck me because of the anticipated climate impacts or impacts that they are already feeling, not just anticipated ones. Um, but then there's also the states where I had such a beautiful positive experience that that really will sit with me forever.
That's lovely. You've already kind of touched on this, but did you also have specific like favorite places that you visited?
Everywhere. And I do mean that because that is the reason that this book happened. I love our country. I really do. I mean, we are a massive country with so many different landscapes, cultures, people, animals. You get all of that in one place. And so I am really proud of what we have. And yet the way we are treating each other and the way we are treating our planet and our nature, it's appalling and embarrassing. And so every place is my favorite in its own way. And that sounds like a cop-out answer, but it is true. And I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't love each place individually. However, I will say Utah and Maine, they're just the best.
That's great. What is the best advice you've picked up while traveling?
Let's see. So be flexible with your plans and be open or willing to change those plans in the moment. I think I used to travel with such rigidity and assumed that everything had to be itineraried out and planned. And then when I was traveling one time, not in this country, but overseas, um, like very last minute, I was with some friends. They were all going to a beach town. I was going to be staying in the city just because I happened to have hotel reservations there. And that morning I woke up and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to the beach town with them and just kind of wing it and figure it out. And it was so much fun. And that was, it doesn't sound like a big deal probably to a lot of people, but to me, somebody who is so structured and organized, that was me letting go and just having fun. And so I think that was a big lesson for me when traveling, and that was years ago. So since then, I have certainly traveled with a bit more wanderlust at heart. And then be aware of your surroundings, especially as a female solo traveler, and listen. I think that is the best thing I've learned because everybody's got a story to tell. And if you ask questions and just let somebody talk to you, you're gonna you're gonna learn from them. You're gonna hear something interesting and maybe find some commonalities and share share in what we have as humanity. And I think with all of us so addicted to our screens, it's easy to lose track of, yeah, we are all connected in some ways. So I think those are the biggest lessons.
You've also traveled a good bit internationally. What are your favorite places that you've been?
Well, you're right. I've traveled currently, I think I'm at 34 countries and all seven continents. And similar to the US, everywhere has its charm and specialness. I absolutely love Kenya. I would go back in a heartbeat if I could. I think, humanity was born out of Central Africa, and that land and those people carry such an ancient wisdom. And while it is only my experience, I was met with such warmth and joy there. And, there is more history than me, a silly white woman, could ever convey. But it is in my experience, a beautiful place, more deeply than just what you see on the surface. So I would absolutely go back to Kenya in a heartbeat if I could. Similarly, I am Italian and I love Italy because it does in some ways feel like going home. And then I love Australia for the adventure and just the vibes. Um, and I could see myself living in Scotland or Chile. So everywhere is just so wonderful and unique. And I could certainly talk about all different kinds of places all day.
That's awesome. Can you give our viewers a writing prompt based on haiku and hope?
Ooh, I love it. So I would suggest going outside. Maybe if you live in a city, maybe try to find a park. If you live in a neighborhood, maybe you have a backyard, or a state park, or anywhere. Go outside, try to get somewhere where there is less like construction, less man-made construction, and give yourself 10 minutes if you can without your phone, and just bring a notebook, and in those 10 minutes, really try to observe what you are hearing, seeing, smelling, maybe even feeling if you're sitting on the ground, and write down what you are experiencing. And ask yourself, okay, I'm hearing birds. I'm hearing a couple different kinds of birds. How does that make me feel? And this starts to get at just the basic concept of nature journaling, which can be really refreshing is the word that comes to mind, but also calming, grounding. And I think too, that's something that we all could use a little bit more of, is that emotional feeling of, hey, take a deep breath, drop your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and just breathe. So I think it's a little bit of a prompt to reconnect with the natural world, not necessarily in poetic form, but maybe as you start to feel on your, as you start to identify your feelings in this experience, in what you are sensing, that might turn into something poetic. You never know. So give yourself the freedom to just express what you are experiencing. And I can almost guarantee you'll walk away feeling a little bit more refreshed and grounded.
I love that. What advice do you have for young writers and nature enthusiasts?
Spend time doing it. Spend time in nature doing the writing. And that doesn't have to look like anything. It just is. Which is hard for, I think, a lot of us to grapple with because we have turned into human doings instead of human beings. And if you are both a nature enthusiast and a poetry lover, or you're aspiring to be in either one of those fields, give yourself the grace to just feel it through. Don't have an agenda because I think that's when you lose the authenticity. And this world needs more people doing what they love than what they feel they are forced to do. And I think that would create a much better, more compassionate planet.
Can you talk a bit about your writing process?
Ooh, so my writing process, I have talked about this recently with a friend of mine who's also in the process of writing a book, and we just kind of share our experiences, best practices, and she and I were just laughing about this, I think yesterday, that she's got some really good structure in place. She writes on certain days. She sets herself kind of time allotted to it. Whereas me, having worked in journalism, currently working in communications, I need deadlines. Otherwise, I am not productive. And so my writing process was often for this book, connecting with my publisher and saying, when do you need this by? Please give me a deadline because otherwise I will just sit on it forever. And once we are into the nitty gritty of writing process, so let's say that I am in that zone, I love going to my local library and putting on some noise canceling headphones, maybe listening to some piano or classical music, and just tuning out the world and writing. Um, I think that's probably my favorite zone or place to be in. And then the writing process itself is kind of free and unstructured. So, particularly with this book, I know I mentioned this earlier in this conversation, everything changed after Alabama. I couldn't tell you what state was going to come out of my pen or keyboard next. Like it just, whatever felt right and whatever felt organic. And I am sure that there are non-writers listening to this and just being like, what the fuck? Like, what do you mean by that? Didn't feel organic. But I can also guarantee you that there are probably some writers listening to this being like, oh, I totally get it. I know exactly what you mean. And I wish that there was a way to describe it other than you just follow what your heart and your brain are telling you to do, and then hope that it comes together in a way that makes some sense. So that sounds so, perhaps that sounds so pretentious and esoteric, but it's the truth.
What are your best strategies for revision?
I read and read and read and read every single draft way too much ad nauseum. And so I think that has value, sure. But the best value is to walk away from your writing and then go look at it with fresh eyes, not just later in the day, but maybe a day or two later, because you will have a different frame of mind and you'll see things clearly. And something that might have been so obvious to you in the moment, you're like, what the heck was I trying to say there? So revisions are extremely valuable, but make sure you have some fresh eyes.
Can you talk a bit about the submission process?
Sure. So, for anyone who is interested in having their own book published, um, what I had done was I researched publishers around the country that would be open to either poetry and or conservation topics. And most publishers have open calls for submissions during certain times of year. And so I found a couple publishers that had open calls during the month of June, a couple years ago, I think 2023. And so I wrote out a proposal, and publishers on their websites make it very clear what you need to submit to them. And so I wrote out two different proposals to two different publishers, and I think I submitted them on June 30th. As I said, I need a deadline. And so I was kind of just, I was starting the pitch process, the submission process. I was just starting it. Those were the first two I sent out because those were the first, June was the first month that had just kind of come up from when I started doing all this research. At that point, a few other publishers were on my calendar to pitch to, but they didn't have open calls until later in the year. So I kind of just sat back and forgot about it until early August 2023. I got an email from my publisher saying, "Hi, we're emailing you again because we haven't heard from you. Are you still interested in publishing this book? We would love to know either way." And turns out they had replied to my initial submission maybe 3 or 4 days after I submitted it, but it went to my spam folder. So I did not know that they had contacted me. And thank goodness they emailed me again, and it actually did make it into my inbox because otherwise this book would not exist. Thank you, Gmail spam. But I immediately emailed them back. I said, I am so interested. Let's get on the phone. Let's talk this out. And so I was very lucky in that it was one of the first two publishers that I had submitted to that were actually interested in this idea.
New fear unlocked.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So now I check my spam folder like fairly regularly.
Do you plan to continue traveling and writing in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I already have my ideas for a second book, which is going to be totally different, but also similar themes, but it won't be just the United States. It's going to be more environment, but a totally different take. So I definitely intend to travel and continue writing.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing more from you.
Thank you.
And you did get some audience questions that I want to touch on really quick before you go. So you have Erin May Photo asking, what was it like growing up for you? First significant childhood memories involving nature.
Oh, that's very sweet. That's a nice question. So my childhood was so stinking fortunate. I had the world's best backyard. We grew up along a creek and a wooded area. So I was often playing outside in the backyard, and this creek, we had canoes, we had tubes that we would float down the creek on, and there were also cliffs on the creek that my older sister, she would often jump off the cliffs into the creek below. And so me as a young kid, I would watch that and be like, oh, can't wait till I get to do that someday. So my childhood just really had everything to do with nature. And I'd say probably one of the earliest memories I have is playing in the backyard in the mud in the creek bed and just like getting so caked in the mud. And then I remember this is a weird kid thing. I remember like feeling the silt in my hands, and I really liked that texture. And so I made a mud ball and I brought it into the house and I put it in the freezer just to see what would happen. Like this was, 4 or 5 year old me. I don't know what science is yet. And so I put it in the freezer, came back to it a couple days later. I was like, oh man, this doesn't feel as cool anymore. It's rock hard. But yeah, I was just experimenting and learning what the world is. So kind of silly, but yeah, just doing all kinds of fun things.
That's great. And your other question from Jackie Angelina Marks. What gave Maggie the idea to tell her story through haiku?
Sure. So I think we kind of touched on this, and that is, to me, the haiku has a rich staying power because it is so short. It is it is short enough that it can tell a moment, not necessarily a story, and it can pique curiosity. And if it is meaningful or resonant, it can be held on to and recalled later to be enjoyed. So I think that to me, haiku was an opportunity to do all of those things, to interest, pique curiosity, tell a moment, and hopefully get people craving and wanting more.
That's great. Thank you so much, Maggie. Were there any questions that I didn't get around to that you hoped I would?
No, this was such a fabulous conversation. And if we had more time, I would love to hear about your writing because you are also an exceptionally talented writer, and I've loved reading some of your work. So I am just honored and thankful that you took the time to speak with me today. I did mean it, not just for the sake of this podcast, but I really loved reading some of your writing. And if there is anywhere else I can find more, or if you are producing anything, it was just like a real pleasure. And I don't know, it was that creative elicitation that I got out of reading some of your work. So I thank you. I don't know, from one writer to another, thank you. It is meaningful to have these kinds of conversations, and I really appreciate being seen and listened to.
That's so nice. Thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah, of course.
Well, it was so great to meet you. So great to read your book, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.